All right. Is there like a tissue or something? Like my allergies are seem to be one. I'm gonna be sniffling up there. Oh, that's perfect. Sorry about that.
No, you're good.
I can feel like the sniffling happen. It's gonna be really annoying, but like it's. All right. Thanks.
All good.
Thanks.
Yeah. Congrats on the book, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks. Sorry.
Hi, welcome to Zibby's Bookshop. We're so excited. It's such a wonderful turnout. Thank you guys so much for coming. We're super excited to host this event. If you have books at the front, so come grab some books. We'll do a signing after. We'll do like a little bit of a question answer for a little bit, and then we'll do audience questions, and then we'll sign books after. So thank you guys so much. Thank you so much for coming, and I'll just hand it over.
Thanks.
My name is Tommy Kendall, and I'm not sure what my qualifications are for being here, other than I've been a long-time Santa Monica resident. I'm not a literary expert. I've never done a book event. Some people are surprised I can read, but my background, I actually had a career in auto racing, so nothing that prepares me for this. But I have to confess that I've driven 200 miles an hour in the rain at Le Mans, and that doesn't bother me. The thought of actually writing a book is totally terrifying to me. I mean, I used to, in school, I somehow made it through UCLA, but whenever there was an assignment, I'm like, how long is it? 12 pages? Oh my God. So when Doug asked me if I would moderate this, I said, sure. I'm not sure if I'm qualified, but so we're going to get straight to him as quickly as possible. This is Doug's fourth book. It's his first narrative nonfiction. So he's done 3 novels, and he doesn't really have a lane that I can tell. And so I think he just does. We're going to find out a little bit more about that. So a New York Times bestseller. And I'm embarrassed to say that with my background in automotive and so forth, I did not know about the mysterious case of Rudolf Diesel before I read the book. So welcome, Doug.
Thank you.
And congratulations. So I guess let's dig right in. I know the story, but how did you end up with this subject matter?
Yeah, well, to your point, it is following things that have genuinely interested me. But clearly, TK is very qualified for this. In addition to driving 200 miles an hour, he's spent a lot of time on the small screen calling races and doing a lot of TV work, and clearly a very charming guy. So we're in great hands. But to your point, following things that have interested me. And so years ago, going all the way back, even before I started writing this, or before I even knew there was a Rudolf Diesel myself, I bought a boat, and some of this story, and I actually haven't really said this part of it in media, but the boat was previously owned by Billy Joel. It's called a Shelter Island, and he was part of the design team that came up with this boat. And we got hull number 1. There are like 50 of these boats now, but we bought hull number 1. So it was his boat, which we bought, and it was old. It was a 96 hull. And I was getting it fixed up. It needed a bit of work. And the people at the marina were saying, you really ought to repower this to diesel engines. And so there's a little bit in the front of the book about this, about how I came to it. And he gave me the spiel that 100% of boat fires come from gasoline engines, none from diesel. The fuel efficiency is 3 or 4 times. So on your 200-gallon fuel tank, you can go 3 or 4 times as far. The fumes are far less. You can take a lit match and drop it into a barrel of diesel fuel and nothing will happen. So I was hooked. So we did repower the boat with diesels. And then a little later, I was looking around for ideas for another novel and came across a list of mysterious disappearances at sea. Rudolf Diesel was on the list. And I thought, oh my gosh, I wonder if this is related to these new engines I got. And of course it was. So I went into this, several year rabbit hole of archives. And we could talk a bit about the research piece as well, because it was during COVID. And so the research was challenging and largely remote and required, developing some friendships with people in different archives around the world. But I was mainly drawn in by the mystery of it. And when I started looking into it, what I found is there were 2 suspects. It kind of has gone down in history, as you know, if you've read the book or have looked into the name at all, as a suicide. If you look it up in the Encyclopedia Britannica or Wikipedia. It's a suicide. But there were two suspects related to murder, either Kaiser Wilhelm, the Emperor of Germany, or John Rockefeller. And I was so intrigued by all of this. And the more I got into it, the more I had a theory of the case. And in the beginning, I was thinking I would write it like fiction. The other three books are all fiction. And so I think, well, I'll probably just do historical fiction. I've got the scaffolding of a story here, and I can fill it in because there's so little written about the man, particularly in the English language. There are a couple of very academic biographies about him, but there's very little about him. And as I got into it, I decided I was finding more information, and then I made some relationships with people in archives. I found even more, and all of it seemed to go toward my initial thoughts about what actually did happen. And I realized I really want to do this as nonfiction, but I didn't know how to do any of that. You know, what I had done in the past was all fiction, and it's a very different process to write and sell fiction from nonfiction. And, you know, with fiction, you tend to write the full manuscript, and then you sell the full manuscript. Some editor believes in it or falls in love with it, and you know, but it really is about 95% of the way there. You've basically written the book, and then you might polish it up a little bit with some input from your editor. With nonfiction, it's not sold that way. You sell a proposal for a book, and there's a fairly standard looking proposal that people would require. You know, might have a sample chapter, so there's typically some writing in there, but you talk about the research you're going to do, you talk about the competitive works in market, but you know, what's the unique research you're going to find and sort of uncover and bring to light that has not previously been you know, published. And so there are a number of things. So my agent, I got a new agent who's much more focused on nonfiction, and he walked me through what a proposal looks like, helped me write it, and then we sold it. All of this took place during COVID, by the way. I was never in a room with any of these people. It was all over Zooms. It was just crazy, but worked out and made a decision to go on the nonfiction lane. So I have had multiple lanes, but one of the threads is all the books have a lot of research in them. So the prior three novels, one is about a bond salesman on Wall Street. It's really about a marriage, but it's set on Wall Street, and about the wacky compensation schemes that we have for, you know, in this case was a guy at Bear Stearns. And it was in that sort of 07, 08 bubble where, you know, if you're compensating someone based on volume, a trader based on volume, he's going to give you volume. Doesn't matter what's in these packages they're selling, but you're not looking at that as a compensation scheme. So it kind of led to the problem. The second book was The Means, which was a political fiction, the intersections between politics and journalism. And the third was Trophy Sons, about our obsession with single sport specialization for youth. And in each of those cases, I did a lot of research, but they were mainly contemporary novels. So it was mostly primary research. I was interviewing people. For the tennis novel, I interviewed James Blake and John Isner and some other great tennis players to inform it. So that type of work that I've done in the past with research lent itself to the research I was doing here, even though this was more historical research. But one last point on that was, I think that one thing I've loved about the fiction is it's a great way to learn and to inform a reader in a way with true facts. It's much easier to learn something through a narrative. Like a textbook is the worst way to learn anything. It's the worst way to learn history. It just, everyone eye glazes and loses it. And so books like what Eric Larson does or David Grann, when you're experiencing it through the first person and it's the things are happening to you, but you're getting historical context through the experience of a narrative, it sticks more. And fiction can be a very powerful way to do that too. You know, a deeply researched novel that's true, that's giving you something true in the format of a novel. Like Min Jin Lee wrote Pachinko. I learned more about colonial Korea through Min Jin Lee's novel that I ever would have learned in a textbook. You know, she really takes you there. It's deeply researched and really well done. And so that's what I was trying to do here. And there's this great line from Rudyard Kipling saying that if history were taught in the form of stories, it would never be forgotten. And that's, you know, what I'm trying to do here, what Eric Larson does so well, and others. So.
Well, now I'm realizing why I was so, why writing a book is so daunting to me is, I mean, you must be a glutton, because if you have a series with a main character, you're kind of just with your imagination, you decide where you're going to take those. Every one of these, you're kind of starting over again. What drew you to research? You came from the business world. What drew you to this kind of book where you love to dig in and Is it thirst for knowledge for yourself, and then how do you convey it?
There is a natural curiosity. And once I got onto the diesel thread, I was like, oh my God, I've got to know everything about this. And then there were things that I completely geeked out on it. Every little thing that my wife would be like, oh my God. And she'll come home and I'm watching like Ancient Aliens on the TV and she's like, holy cow. or World War II in color or stuff like that. I just go deep on all of that stuff. Time in the archive, looking, getting old books and smelling the glue of the binding, all of that stuff. I just love the atmosphere of it and the information. So it's a bit of a glutton, but I really do love it. And I also love the alone time is, I think any writer has to be able to embrace alone time. And I have this podcast that I do where I talk to authors, and I had Scott Turow on, and he was joking that he tells his wife when he gets ready to go work, to go write his books, he says, all right, I'm going to go hang with my imaginary friends. And then off he goes up the stairs into his office and he gets with his characters. And it is a bit like that, and you have to sort of enjoy it. In our house, Rudolf Diesel became like a character, and our kids knew the story, and they all had a theory of the case, like this is maybe what happened, like Dad, what about this? And so all that stuff is I totally enjoy it. It's maybe gluttonous in the sense of the volume of time, but I love it.
So obviously we're not going to do spoilers because not everyone has read the book, but there was a lot going on, and to say people overuse superlatives, but there isn't anything that today that is a piece of freight that is not touched by a diesel engine, between ships, trains, and trucks. I would say it's got to be 90% of the world's cargo today is moved by it. So hard to think of a more impactful invention.
Yeah.
And but I also cannot think of another invention that is actually named after the person. Cell phone is not named after someone named Cellular, or and I'd never thought I'd heard diesel. And so talk a little bit about, and when I was reading the book, I had to kind of put myself back into, there was no such thing as gas, there were no airplanes, there was there was steamship. So talk about the time, set up what was going on, and how impactful this this invention was.
It was an incredible advance in power, like our way to generate power out of natural resources. So the steam engine, and I try to, for those who've read the book, you might remember this scene in there. I sort of try to bring out that scene that we all remember from the movie Titanic, where on the ship in the fiery orange furnace, and they're shoveling coal into the furnace to heat the boiler full of water. The water turns to steam and moves the gears of the engine. And a ship like the Titanic could be hundreds of people on the ship whose job it is to move this coal around into the furnace. And they all need to eat. They need a place to sleep. You have rooms full of coal. So one thing about the diesel engine is it completely transformed merchant marine shipping, cargo ships. And there's a great line from 1912 when Winston Churchill comes to tour the first diesel-powered cargo ship. And he calls it the greatest maritime masterpiece of the century, because you now have this cargo ship that has way more space devoted to cargo as opposed to people shoveling coal, and the fuel efficiency is such that it can circumnavigate the globe without a fuel stop, as opposed to having to stop in the Philippines and recoal to the next island to recoal and get around the world. So it just completely transformed transportation. And to this day, 100%, there's one nuclear powered cargo ship, which is not even really functional or good. It's almost all cargo ships are diesel powered more than 100 years later. Just incredible. Rails, anything larger than a passenger car on the roads, diesel, and still about a third of passenger cars are diesel as well. Heavy farm equipment. It's been our power source of the age. And we think about, it's still combustion, it's still using petroleum. So there are pollution effects. But if you compare it to what was happening in 1897 when diesel first brought this out, those things on the Titanic, it also had a chimney apparatus, and it was just emitting towers of black, partially burnt particles of coal and unbelievable pollution. So we really brought it forward. And actually, just a couple of weeks ago, there was an article about biodiesel and advances they've made with that. So what Rudolf was advocating was in the late 1890s to have vegetable oil or nut oil as the fuel for the diesel engine. And they're now doing a little bit more of that. So his original vision more than 100 years ago is actually coming a little bit more into play. And what they're finding is the emissions are way cleaner using these fuels. So if we had been doing this, as he suggested all that time ago, we might be much farther along with it. Although, it does remain. I know you know the story. Willie Nelson's tour bus with a diesel engine can operate on recycled kitchen grease.
Yeah.
So it does maintain great flexibility with regard to fuels. And Rudolph's position was that every nation can have fuel independence. If you can grow vegetables, you can grow your own fuel.
Well, to get into some of the main suspects in this, you talked about Kaiser Wilhelm and John Rockefeller. War was transformed by this invention as well. Even a steamship, which could do the job, but it also left a trail everywhere it went. So you can see them literally coming days away on the horizon. Yeah. So no such thing as sneaking up on folks. But so you had that kind of a situation. But so again, we take so many things for granted on how you go about it. So that was a big theme in terms of Rudolf was German. Mm-hmm. They were trying to compete with the British Navy and so forth. So take us through, Kaiser Wilhelm, a little bit of a primer on why he was so interested, and then we'll get into John Rockefeller.
Germany at this time was exploding as an industrial power, and there was this book. I talk about it a tiny bit in this book, but there was a book by Alfred Thayer Mahan, who was an American admiral, and he wrote "The Influence of Sea Power on History," I think is the full title. And it was about every advanced civilization that has really become a global power had a powerful navy. And Kaiser Wilhelm, in the wake of Bismarck uniting all of Germany, before that it was like 39 different states, but then what we know as Germany as a nation at that time, the German Empire, as we came to know it, started in 1870, and it was growing. And Kaiser Wilhelm felt that in order to fuel that growth, he needed an empire. He needed colonies around the world, and therefore needed a strong navy to have these colonies from overseas bring raw materials back to Germany and fuel the growth. Now, at that time, Britain was very powerful, but they were, an island nation, and they felt all of their security relied on being the most powerful naval force. So as Germany started building up their navy, Britain felt very threatened, and everyone's kind of threatened by Germany at this time. They've been very expansionist in their foreign policy. And so it ignited this Anglo-German naval arms race that went right through the late 1800s into the early 1900s. And then in the end, Germany really realized they couldn't catch up with Great Britain. They were just so far along in building capital ships, like the battleships. The Dreadnought launched in 1906. They didn't have the wherewithal to catch up, because they also needed to maintain a huge army, which Britain did not. Jackie Fisher, who was a famous admiral at the time, joked that the army is nothing but a projectile to be fired upon land by the Navy. So they could put their money toward naval resources, whereas Germany, they were surrounded by Russia and all these France. They had to keep a strong army as well as a navy, and they just couldn't catch Britain. But then they realized submarines might actually make the battleships defunct. All these huge capital ships of Great Britain, if they got way ahead on U-boats, they could eliminate Britain's advantage. And so they started throwing all the resources behind U-boats, and you couldn't have a U-boat or a submarine without diesel power. The gasoline and kerosene engines would not work for underwater vessels.
Steam, of course, would not.
And steam, of course, would not. Yeah. So diesel suddenly is at the core of this rivalry. And the engine was young enough still that Rudolf Diesel was still kind of the wizard whose direct involvement was your best shot at building a great submarine diesel program. So he became a very central figure at that time.
Now, this wasn't what he dreamt of for his invention. It's exactly the opposite. Mm-hmm. I mean, talk a little bit about his upbringing, what his idea was, and setting in that time. He grew up actually in Paris, mm-hmm. but to talk a little bit about Rudolf and how that feeds into with these people fighting over his great war invention.
Yeah, I mean, he was. I think he recognized, having his life surrounded by wars. He recognized peace through strength and deterrence is a real thing. But he did not imagine that his engine would ever be utilized as a weapon. Certainly, like at that time, the submarine was really thought to be a weapon with questionable sort of ethics. The stealth weapon. But he was born in 1858 in Paris. In 1870, the Franco-Prussian War broke out, and so all German. Anyone of German heritage was kicked out of France. So they go to London, but really with the shirts on their back. And they go at the time and to the place of the Dickens novel, Oliver Twist. So, and he's the same age as the title character. So he shows up at the age 12 into the Hackney area, the Hackney neighborhood of London, which is where Oliver Twist was, in the the peak of the Industrial Revolution. Like, so they were really living in tenement housing. And then he gets sort of a lifeline from an uncle in Germany saying, send Rudolf here. We'll educate him. This will be a chance for him to, get a break. And so he goes, and he just has a gifted brain. He's immediately shining as a student, and it's sort of a tracking system in education there. And he clearly was marked as someone who had a gift for mathematics and engineering. So he gets on that academic track, and it's sort of off and running from that point. And a quick note on research, because there are a number of different places that I tapped into for research. One was Maschinenfabrik Augsburg Nuremberg, which was one of the companies that first sponsored his development work in the 1890s, and that been through a few mergers and things, but still around. And they have a great archive of his personal effects. The Deutsches Museum has a great archive of personal effects. And I made remote relationships with people there who would scan lots of things, but it was all in German. So he had these great diaries from trips to America, one in 1904, one in 1912. And they're wonderful accounts of a European view into American cities at that time that were sort of just springing up. The rail stations are like plywood with rusty nails, and no subways, no bathrooms really, because people are urinating all over the train stations. He couldn't get over our eating habits. He's like, these Americans, like the combinations of food are so bizarre. And like they eat ice cream in every meal, sometimes twice a meal, they're having ice cream. And, but in order to get this, because it was all in German, I needed to translate. So I call up a buddy of mine at my old high school who was running the English department at that time. I'm like, who speaks German over there? Who's teaching German? So he put me in touch with this guy, Gerhard Reich, who spoke both German and French and taught both, who was perfect. So given Rudolph's background of French and German, he would sometimes write his letters to his wife, and he would toggle between the two languages. So when he was writing more, factual stuff, it was German. But then, for example, he went to this one fair where the French had a booth at the fair selling lingerie, and then he starts writing in French to his wife, for the more romantic side of the letters. But Gerhard could do both. And so he translated reams of material for me. And then he became as obsessed with the mystery too. I'd get like these midnight calls from Gerhard, like, Doug, I've got a theory on the case, and like we'd talk through it. And then to round that back, I went to my high school after publication, and Gerhard and I got to do an event together, which was really fun.
So you probably couldn't have done it without those archives, because something that happened this long ago. You said there's very little written. That was one of my main questions: is how did you get so much information? Because the letters to the wife, obviously, those come through. So that sort of answers that.
Well, one other piece of that actually is it's amazing what you can do in the form of what I would call library research now, just from my desk with newspaper archives. So much of this stuff is scanned, and more gets scanned every day. That in a way, it's almost easier from that lane to do it now than it would have been in 1920 or 30, because then you'd have to go to Munich and London and pull out dusty old cabinets and find newspapers. And now it's scanned. So, some require fee, some are free databases, but you can do keyword searches and sleuth around a little bit and do a lot of research through old newspapers and not leave your desk chair.
You might be the only person who has read some of those articles. If you think about it, who wouldn't go back to try to figure out what happened? Now let's switch to Rockefeller. And it took me a while to understand. I said, why would Rockefeller be against it? He's an oil guy, but tell us why he was so against diesel as an invention. It probably ended up making him actually the wealth maybe came after Standard Oil was broken up. So talk about Rockefeller and why he was so against.
There's actually a quote from Diesel's 1912 trip through America where he says, I would love to run your whole rail system and I could run it all on butter, basically saying like vegetable oil. We don't need petroleum. And so he said, I can break the American fuel monopoly and I don't need a law to do it, referencing the Sherman Energy. So I can do it through the power of this technology. And so he made a very pointed threat to Rockefeller in 1912 that was picked up in many American newspapers as well. But his whole point was we don't need to be beholden to these oil trusts. Now, he also was advocating, particularly for Germany and Great Britain, who had great resources of coal in the ground. They had no oil.
Right.
They had tons of coal. And he could also run the engine
coal tar.
on coal tar.
Okay.
Yeah. So you could sort of create, which is like a sludge that you can get from coal. And it's a great fuel for the diesel engine too.
So there's probably another book on how things went from the biofuel to petroleum. Maybe Rockefeller said, if you can't beat them, join them, kind of thing, and came up with.
Well, I mean, I can sort of talk about how Standard Oil kind of fended that off. They always made the business case for biofuels less feasible. And one thing people forget about Standard Oil is from their founding in 1870 until beyond 1900, they were primarily in the illumination business. They were making kerosene for illumination, and gasoline in the early days was a byproduct that they would throw away from the refining process. And so when Standard Oil was trying to get into the Chinese market in the late 1800s, they gave away kerosene lanterns. And in China, they'd been using natural gas or various oils for illumination. And Rockefeller said, hey, there's this wonderful little lamp and it's free and it burns kerosene. And people were like, wow, this is great. And then cheap kerosene, and then the price of kerosene would go up, and he'd sort of captured the market in that way. So he sort of eliminated the business case for alternatives. And so you can imagine the refining infrastructure, the amount of land needed to grow enough vegetables or nuts to create enough oil and a refining to power engines through these alternative biofuels at the time. He would go and say, well, here's cheap gasoline. Like, why would you spend all this money to build all that out when I can provide this gasoline for a low price? And so there was never a business case to go down something other than the petroleum path in those early days. So he was able to capture that market as well.
Now, one of the other big challenges, we take manufacturing so for granted in terms of metallurgy and so forth. I mean, so it took him a while he had this idea, which everybody could see the potential, but the potential was unrealized for a long time. And then they finally, so talk a little bit about that. Was that some of his alliances, one of which was with the Adolphus Bush. So talk a little bit about some of that. He thought America was kind of odd, but he also was fascinated with how innovative and sort of free-spirited they were.
And the potential for growth there. He predicted that America would soon be the sort of global superpower. The timing of his engine, getting to the metallurgy piece, if you go back to the James Watt days, 100 years earlier, they were making steam engines. They didn't have advanced metallurgy to contain the pressure. They were sealing things with rope and losing enormous amounts of pressure and heat in these very inefficient engines. Now, the metallurgy advanced by the time Diesel was there, but he was still very much on the cutting edge, like pushing the boundaries of what the engine could do in terms of the very high pressure that he was building in his cylinders in order to make the engine work. And he had to use the most expensive materials, and his engine was much heavier than the gasoline engines. And here in America, they didn't need the fuel efficiency that Diesel was pushing so much because the fuel was so abundant. In Denmark or other countries where they were having to import oil or coal, they didn't have natural supplies at the ready, and it was a little bit more precious. Efficiency mattered more. Here in America, it was like there was oil everywhere, coal everywhere, and so there wasn't as big a push for efficiency here. And so the Diesel was a harder sell because it was a bigger upfront investment. So the sort of the gasoline kerosene engines that were easier to build, less expensive, work because they're just it burns twice as much fuel, but we got fuel everywhere. So it was a harder sell here. But you're right to point out that Adolphus Bush was the diesel pioneer in North America. When Rudolf Diesel introduced the engine in 1897, he followed an international licensing model that most inventors or companies followed at that time, which was to sell the exclusive rights to manufacture and market the technology by national territory. So someone took the license for France, and for Russia, it was the Nobel family. And in America, it was Adolphus Bush, who had initially licensed the diesel engine for powering his breweries and pumping water in his breweries. But he also started a separate company that was building diesel engines for the U.S. Navy for their submarine program.
I suspect Kevin Larry would approve of that. Watching Shark Tank, he seems to like those kinds of deals. But it allowed him to expand quickly and other people would invest alongside to develop those territories. I mean, before we get into questions, I guess, without giving anything away, how confident are you of your conclusion? Because it's a mystery that's over 100 years old, and it was accepted this is what happened. There were some questions about it. How you propose a very different outcome. How confident are you? Very,
and increasingly so after publication, because a number of UK special forces and British intelligence folks have contacted me since and said 100% this is what happened. I know it's a circumstantial case, although if you ask any defense or prosecutor, a criminal defense or criminal prosecutor, they'll say most murder cases are circumstantial. And it's very rare that you have someone say, I saw the knife go in, and that person, and by the way, that testimony is usually the least reliable. The eyewitness testimony is almost always wrong. So they're largely circumstantial cases. And this is a circumstantial case, as you point out, it's more than 100 years old. But when you eliminate other theories, when there's just like no logic behind them, and then only one sort of advances to round everything out. But anyway, a number of people during the writing process supported the conclusion, and a number have come in afterwards, said 100%. Now, a lot of things are in there under the 50-year rule. There are a lot of things that stay in archives and stay confidential in perpetuity. And I've talked to a number of other authors, like Howard Bloom's, like some stuff just, it never comes out. It will never come out. And every country has that, the US, the UK. So I'm hoping this shakes something loose. I would love to see a smoking gun in some file somewhere.
Well, why don't we open it up for questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
That was
Thank you.
that was cool. I learned a ton about. It's funny. I don't know when the history switch flips for us, but when I was younger, I was like, oh my. Maybe it's because it's so dry when it's not taught with a narrative. So, but I learned a ton about the run up to the First World War and some of that stuff. So, questions.
I've been listening to the audiobook and I'm almost finished and I cannot stop listening. And I noticed I recognized the voice of the narrator and I had to look him up and I realized it was from Devil in the White City by Eric Larson. And I wanted to know if you had any input into who narrated your book.
That is a funny story, which reminds me of another story I wanted to tell you about the title. So I'll tell both. Scott Brick is the narrator for the audiobook.
Amazing.
He's very theatrical and he does blah, blah, blah. So yeah, he does accents and the whole bit. And he does a lot of thrillers. He's done the Clive Cussler novels and some Nelson DeMille, and the version of the Oscars for audiobook readers, it's called the Audies, and he's won like 80 Audies, and he comes with his own following. So I actually had him on my podcast because I talked to authors and I thought, oh, maybe listeners want to hear from someone who's a famous audiobook reader to hear about the craft. Because I was thinking maybe I'll read my own audiobook, but it's an art to it. They're sort of actors in a way, and it's not something you can just do. Like, he's really good at it. And he has a following too. So one of the nice things for me is many people will purchase and listen to anything Scott Brick does. They're just like Scott Brick groupies. And so my audiobook sales were great. I got a whole bonus number of thousands of buyers who were just like, I'll do anything Scott Brick does. So after he came on my show and I interviewed him, he's like, what are you up to? I'm like, oh, I've got this book coming out. I was like, send it to me. Maybe I'll do it. And so I said, oh, that'd be great. So I mailed it to him and I called Simon & Schuster because we were just at the point of trying to pick the audiobook reader. And they sent me 3 examples. Typically what they do, they'll say, you choose, listen to these options, whoever's voice you like best, let us know, and then we'll try and hire that person. So they sent me 3. I'm like, I'll listen to these, but would you also send it to Scott Brick? They're like, he's not going to, he's like a big deal. He's probably not going to do this. I'm like, just send it. Like he said he might. And so they did. And they're like, hey, good news. Scott Brick said he'd do it. And so it worked out. But that reminds me of one other story around the title. And so throughout the writing process, I was talking to my editor. We didn't really have a title that captured everything because the book does a number of different things. And, it's kind of a biography. It's like Engines for Dummies. It's a primer on European diplomacy, turn of the century. And then it's an Agatha Christie whodunit. And we're like, how are we going to get all this in a title? And I'm like, we're just going to get a bottle of red wine and we're going to figure this out one night. And late in the game, I came up with this title, Engines and Empires. And I liked it. And I said to my editor, he's like, love it, done. And we had galleys, galleys look like the paperback. It's like pretty slick looking. It looks like what the paperback will look like when that comes out, but then, it says not for sale. And that goes out to sort of get awareness going for the book at bookshops and reviewers and like the New York Times and stuff like that. So the galleys are out and I'm out in California at a book event. My editor calls and he said, just had the internal meeting with a sales force at Simon & Schuster. Jonathan Karp, like the CEO, the big CEO of all the imprints at Simon & Schuster was there. He loves the book, charming book, great history. Everything's great, but the title, we got to talk about the title. I'm like, we're revisiting the title now? Like we're already out with this thing, I thought. And he goes, well, everyone kind of thought we should talk about mystery, like Engines and Empire. It could be anything. Like you still don't know what you're about to read. Engines and Empires could be anything. It's like, we want to get mystery in there. Like it's this thing. And we like Diesel should also be in the title too. We got to get that up top. So, Karp suggested the mysterious case of Rudolf Diesel. I'm like, all right. That sounds kind of nice. And, but I'm not sure, like I still kind of had Engines and Empires, like pride and ownership of that. So I get to the book festival and I'm having breakfast with this writer who I really admire named Lawrence Wright. And I think he's great. He's written fiction, nonfiction, right to the New Yorker, a terrific guy. And so I'm just meeting him, but I'm so stressed out about this that I bring up the story and tell him the story. And he's like, I kind of like Engines and Empires better. I'm like, oh no, like now what? And so in the end, my editor calls me. He's like, look, you can do what you want. Your book. But it is the sales and marketing team, and they're meant to promote your book when it comes out. And Jonathan Karp is the CEO. But do what you want. And but anyway, went with sales and marketing on this one. Don't want to go against them. So that was the title. So I did not even name the book. Jonathan Karp did. And of my 4 books, I realized, like when I thought back, I've only named 2 of the 4. The other 2, I've named half my books. The other half are other people.
Well, I like it. Any other questions?
I have one. Did you try to contact anyone in his lineage of his family?
I did. And I spoke to 2 people who are descendants of Rudolf. One was a woman who was descended from his daughter, Hetty. And she actually lived in Connecticut for like a summer. She's German, that's still in Germany, but she was over in Connecticut for a summer, not far from where I live. So we had a nice conversation about that. The other person was descended from his uncle. So not a direct line, but his last name was Diesel. And he lives in France on the border. He's a physician in France. And he actually had done a ton of family sleuthing around. And I met him in time. I had not yet published. And he directed me to a couple of archives I had not yet found, but he had found. One was an archive in Denmark. One of the big companies, shipbuilding companies, that was building diesel engines and actually built that cargo ship, the Selandia that I mentioned earlier, that Churchill toured. And they built a sister ship called the Fionia that Kaiser Wilhelm toured, both cargo ships, merchant ships. There was a archive in Denmark that had a ton of old photos and really cool stuff. And so Jean-Philippe Diesel, thank you. He pointed me there, and I got in time to include some of those photos in the book.
I read in one of the books, I haven't read the book yet before reading very much, that Diesel's intent, or he aimed to have the diesel used only for peaceful purposes.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sensing there's a tinge of idealism in the man as well. And could you speak to that?
Yes. So in 1883, he wrote this list of intended uses, which was like woodworking shop. His father was a craftsman, like bookbinder, worked with leather, stuff like that. At a time when a steam engine was as big as the workshop, it was an unrealistic source of power. So he's like, I'm going to build this compact engine for decentralized economies, for artisans out in more rural situations for whom the steam engine is not a realistic thing. So now the Tesla electric motor ended up doing that more than the diesel engine did. The irony is what he intended for the engine to be, it was the opposite. It ended up being the engine of big business and of war, which he didn't have. But if you look at his 1883 list, it's like basically craftsmen and dentistry and stuff like that.
Like micropower.
Yeah, like exactly. Yeah. And so there's one other point I was going to make on this, but I lost my track of thought there. I'll come back to that if I can think of it. But I know what it was. I was going to say that with the war piece, by 1903, 1904, France in particular was using the diesel engine for submarine power. It was this controversial stealth weapon. And Diesel knew that. And he still was working very hard to make the diesel functional for submarine use. And he was helping France with their submarine program, knowing it was for war at this point. It was like, he wasn't like, oh, I don't want this, I'm only going to help it for this other stuff. He helped it for that. And this, I find this interesting in the context of what we've seen throughout history. The Cugnot steam car, which is something that he saw in the museum in France when he was a little boy. There was this old mechanical, technical museum, and it had this Nicolas Cugnot steam car that it would go like 1 mile an hour. It's this huge metal teapot, like basically a giant tricycle. It could go about 1 mile an hour under steam power, but it was powerful. It could haul cannon and things like that. So this invention that the guy used maybe for farming ended up getting co-opted by the French government as a implement of war to haul cannon around. So it happened there, but this term came into more common use in the 40s and 50s called technical sweetness. And it describes this feeling of euphoria that an inventor gets when their invention advances, and that feeling of euphoria can then overwhelm any sense of caution that maybe it shouldn't advance. And so it came into common usage with Oppenheimer and the bomb. So technical sweetness. And then, we talk about it these days with AI, like it's really going fast, but whoa, maybe we should figure things out before it really advances. And I think Diesel had an element of that too, because he was feeling euphoric that, wow, a submarine can only operate on diesel power, these other things. And, he was not thinking at all that, this stealth weapon that, you sink a ship at sea, you can rescue no crew. They all die. It's not like, and British admirals at that time in the early 1900s think this is not the weapon of a British, this is not an honorable weapon. We don't want submarines. Mm-hmm. So it was a controversial weapon in that sense. You can rescue no crew or cargo at all, but Diesel was still trying to advance it. So I think there's an element of him switching from that 1883 list to what he's trying to do in the early 1900s of like the technical suite.
It was so hard, all the stuff he went through, and he was close and so forth. So any sort of acceptance, and it was heady stuff. He was a big deal when one of the better known.
Yeah, I mean,
inventors
1912, everyone, when he came to America in 1912, everyone was like, when can I get a minute with him? And so he met with Thomas Edison. He met with all the people from the Pennsylvania Railroad. Henry Ford offered him a job. He was a huge global name in 1912 and 1913 when he disappeared. So when he disappeared, it was headlines of the New York Times, it was, headlines of the Moscow papers, and of course, all throughout Western Europe where he mainly was. So.
Maurice?
I'm wondering if you're hooked on nonfiction now or historical fiction. You may be are hooked on historical rather than fiction, and if you're maybe going to keep going down this road.
I am. So a couple months after publication of this book, I re-signed with S&S for 2 more books that will be narrative nonfiction, in the same vein as this. And I love doing both. I love writing fiction too, but and they're similar in a way, but I have really loved my experience with this. I did love that research piece, like the nerd side of Indiana Jones. I may have mentioned to you, like when you uncover something like, wow, Diesel said this, and 1 week later, Churchill said that, like when they were both in London, and you draw these crazy connections. It was really fun. And then writing it, with fiction, in a way, it's harder because you're free to write whatever you want, and you're beholden to nothing. Here you really are beholden to the facts. The notes thing is really a headache, and getting all the things sourced correctly is a whole heap of work afterward to make it right. But with this, the story is kind of written for you. You just have to research it, and you have to get it right. There's no writer's block with this. I mean, I don't really think there's writer's block, period. You haven't thought it through enough if you're having writer's block. But with this, the story's kind of done for you. It's just the key is to tell it with energy and tell it with clarity. And those are equally important to keeping it interesting. With energy, you want the sentences to crackle, and that keeps the interest alive. But also with clarity, because it's a confusing story. And I've read a lot of books, if they skip around timelines or there's too much of this, if it's not clear, it's impossible to be interested. If you're reading it, you just get sort of frustrated, like, what is he talking about? I've kind of lost it here. We were at 1905, but now we're at 1910 and then back to 1890. Like, it's impossible to be interested if it's not clear. So that's the hard part about writing, is to really, and in order to tell something simply and clearly, you have to know it deeply, so.
This is rare in that it's nonfiction, but there's also mystery to it. So are there more stories that are unresolved? Can you give us?
Yeah, this next one, I would say, has the same element of hidden history.
Uh-huh.
It's like, as Mike Rowe says with his podcast, it's things you didn't know about people you do. And so it's got elements of that.
I love that's the way I heard it. His short pods are so great.
So
yeah, okay.
It's awesome. So it's got elements of that, and that you're like, I noticed where Diesel, you pass it multiple times a day. but for many people, they didn't know, including me 8 years ago, I didn't know there was a Rudolf Diesel.
Mm-hmm.
So it's got that hidden history and things you didn't know about people you definitely do. But I'm not like solving a crime in this next one, really.
Kind of like that Kendall Jenner is named after me. That's something that, which is true. But
Seriously?
Seriously, yes.
No.
Yeah. From racing, I raced with Bruce back in the day, and when Kendall started getting famous, my wife said, "I think she's named after you." They told me because they were when she was born, we named our daughter after you, and so I'm like, oh. And then I ran into Bruce when he was still Bruce, and he said, "Tommy, I named my daughter after you." I'm like,
oh my God. That is the most interesting thing we've said all show on YouTube.
I'm not sure Kendall knows it, but
She does now.
yes.
That's funny.
Yeah, there
That'll
you go.
be the headline. Like,
There you go.
We try to like
Things you didn't know about people you know. In my case, things you didn't know about people you've never heard of. So
let's stay on that thread for one more moment, though. Like, have you met Kendall?
I have not.
Okay.
I have not. No.
That's very funny. All right, we're off that thread.
How do you think the world would be different had you lived?
I think we might have accelerated some of the things were like that article I mentioned from a few weeks ago talking about biodiesel and how the emissions are much cleaner running with that as the fuel. I think that might have been maybe that would have been brought forward 100 years. Who knows? Because that was certainly the track he was pushing.
And he really was a maestro, because once all these groups that licensed the technology, they still had trouble without him.
Yeah.
Which is why, the various navies and so forth. So he really was a genius in terms of that. So
yeah, he was still the maestro in those years. And I can't remember the name, it's in the book, but he had a sort of a core group of sort of ambassadors that he really trained up to a high level with the engine. And then he could give them each a region. Like, you're going to handle Great Britain, you guys are going to handle the Nordic countries, you're going to be in America. So he tried to send out emissaries who he had brought up to a high level, but nobody was at his level.
Yeah. You take it for granted because we can learn how to build a house on YouTube now. And so anybody else?
So on that same vein, I found it kind of interesting to do kind of the arc of diesel and how efficient it was as a tool for the last 100 years. But today we're kind of arguing about internal combustion engines versus Teslas. With the average Tesla powered by marginal coal burn, kind of feels like an interesting topic with versus his direction with biofuels.
Yeah. One interesting thing in the book too is that it's like the more things change, the more they stay the same. And I think you might, it's in a footnote maybe of the book, but it talks about New York City in 1905 had a fleet of taxi cabs that were all electric. And there was a power charging station on Broadway in Times Square, powering up these things. So it's like 100 years plus later, we're back to some of these same things.
Speaking of the technical side, there's a lot of room left to develop combustion too, because right now I think the most efficient internal combustion engines, like the Formula One cars now, are approaching 50%, meaning you burn a gallon of fuel and 50% of it goes into moving it and 50% is lost as heat. So there's huge, and it's still been far and away the cheapest way to move stuff, and the cheaper things are, it helps more people's standard of living.
Just last week, a company in China announced a new diesel engine that hit like 56%. It's like the highest fuel efficiency number that's been achieved. But it's still, which is crazy. Still, why aren't we at like 90, 99?
Well, it's again, my crew chief would laugh if he heard me trying to talk about engines, because he's like, you don't know anything about them. But I'm fascinated by the concept and so forth. And so hybrid makes the most sense, because all that, so you just burn a gallon of fuel and now you've got this car going. When you come to a stop, all the energy that only 50% moved the car, it is all lost as heat energy through the brakes. Regenerative brakes now, and it's still relatively inefficient at how it converts kinetic energy back into potential energy stored in a battery. But every single car, and like when I see a big truck come to a stop, I'm like,
how much energy is
lost. So if every vehicle should have some sort of battery storage for the regenerate to get it going again, that's why hybrids also boost efficiency so much in stop-start traffic is because it's not lost and it gets put back into motion. So little primer there.
That and Jenner. That's 2 huge ads.
I think we have time for, one more question.
Did anyone else want to ask? TK, maybe using this audience as a reader poll. Do we have a poll of who liked Engines and Empires?
Oh yeah, little focus group. Who would have rather had Engines and Empires? Okay, and then Mysterious Case of Rudolf Diesel. Okay.
I like the ring of Engines and Empires, but actually, this has a little more draw to it.
Oh,
Engines and
interesting.
Empires could be a text.
That could be a series for TV.
Could be
Yeah.
the TV series.
TV series, Engines and Empires.
Totally.
It's fun. So to round out that conversation, on my podcast last week, I recorded with Eric Larson, and that episode will come out on Tuesday. But this story came up, and because he's got great titles for all his books, and his book coming out on Tuesday is called The Demon of Unrest. It's about the 5 months leading up to Civil War. And so I told him the story. He's like, I like it. I like The Mysterious Case of Rudolf Diesel better too. And then he had some really well thought out reasons, like right on the spot, for why it was better. Some of what you said as well. And so that made me feel better.
Well, on that note, thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
sir.
you
That was
so
fun.
much. It was fun. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
And now we're gonna sign some books, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, books up front
Yep.
to purchase, and we can sign after.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Yeah. Me, and this is for my nephew.
Great.
The artist.
Oh, great.
So-